Now, Nigel, I think Nigel's probably given 3 or 4 or more presentations, so he should be very familiar to most of us. But just quickly, his childhood was spent traveling the world with his father, who was a diplomat, lived in various countries. Then he had a career in banking with Citibank, again, living and working in various countries. But he finally got caught and moved to Perth in 2012 after marrying Heather. He volunteers with the Capital Radio or Capital Community Radio in Perth, where he's their resident historian, compiling stories and doing interviews. And finally, he was the past president of the WA chapter we were just talking about of the society, and did a magnificent job growing our membership in Perth as well. So thank you, Nigel. I'm really looking forward to hearing about your 5 artists.
Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on the planet. I think there's a few members traveling internationally who were going to tune in, suffering clearly from insomnia, so nothing better to do. We're heading for a very hot day here today in Perth, 40 degrees, but as I said earlier, we Sangropers can take it. So, welcome to my talk on naval maritime artists. Here we have just an opening slide of, it's entitled "Thank You to U-53" from the crew of the USSS Housatonic by Claus Bergen, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, February 1917. I just want to say something about copyright, very important when we're talking about art and so on. And thank you to David for assistance in talking about making the points about copyright. I'm not going to go through the whole of this, but just read out the piece in bold in the second and third para. The Society's purpose in reproducing images of these paintings and photographs is purely educational. That is to enhance community understanding of Australian and other nations' naval and maritime history. There is no intention on the part of the Society or Nigel Rogers to profit from this initiative. Users of the website of this presentation are requested to respect copyright and acknowledge the persons concerned if an image is used for private purposes. Profiting from the work of another is illegal. So, my talk today will be a brief tour of some of my favourite naval and maritime artists, or as follows, and also to acknowledge the artwork and photography of them all. The first one is Claus Bergen. He is German, was German. Ib Odfeldt, fellow of the Australian Society of Marine Artists. Ib is Danish Australian. Francis Smitheman, fellow of the Royal Society of Art. He's a Brit. The photography of Frank Hurley, Order of the British Empire. Everybody will be familiar with Frank Hurley, extraordinary photographer of various operations and expeditions he was involved in. And finally, Ian Hansen, fellow of the Australian Society of Marine Artists, fellow of the fellow of the Artists Society. Ian, I think, is one of your favourites, David, so I've included him. Various sources, including the World Wide Web and other publications and institutions. Claus Bergen. In 1914, Bergen was appointed marine painter to the Kaiser Wilhelm, he became the official naval marine artist to the German Navy. And in June and July 1917, Bergen took the unprecedented step of joining the crew of the submarine U-53 under Captain Lieutenant Hans Rose on an Atlantic combat patrol. The series of paintings that resulted is often considered to be among his finest works. And in the interwar period, he painted numerous officially commissioned large-scale land and seascapes, while his friendship with the commanders such as Erich Raeder and Karl Dönitz led to continuing work for the German Navy. So let's just go back to this painting here by Claus Bergen. It's the SS Housatonic, built by Barclay Curle and Company Limited in Glasgow in 1891 and owned at the time of a loss by E.F. Gear of New York. It's an American steamer of some 3,000 tons. On February the 3rd, 1917, Housatonic, under the command of Captain Thomas Enzer, on a voyage from Galveston to Liverpool with a cargo of grain and flour, was sunk by the German submarine U-53 Hans Rose, 20 miles south of Bishop's Rock off the Scilly Isles in the UK. Rose allowed the crew into the boats and then sank the Housatonic with charges. And upon Enzer's request, Rose then towed the boats for 1.5 hours in a direction towards the coast of the UK until the trawler Salvatore was seen at the horizon. Salvatore, not reacting, Rose, the commander of the U-boat, said to Enzer, "That fellow is asleep, but I'll wake him up for you." Rose then had a shot fired from his gun deck, which woke up the crew of the Salvatore, and they made all speed to the area. By then, U-53 had submerged and escaped. Right, let's move on. This is one of my favorite paintings. It's called The Commander. It's a portrait of a German U-boat commander of World War I standing on the afterdeck of a U-boat, facing towards the horizon. He wears a cap, a jacket, over a naval sweater, leather gloves, and knee-high boots, as he stands with his hands clasped behind his back on the wet deck. The large painting was the result of official war work undertaken by the artist when he was aboard U-53, crossing the Atlantic to Newport and back in a stormy voyage of many weeks. The resulting images were then used to illustrate the book U-Boat Stories. The picture is entitled The Commander and portrays Captain Lieutenant Hans Rose, who was the commander of U-53. The text in the book refers to the responsibilities and duties of such a commander, and this painting has tried to capture these emotions through the unusual composition. The role of a commander was beset with many perils. The threat of death was ever present, and the painting aims to evoke the vigilance and silence necessary in enemy-infested seas, as well as the isolation of command itself. The view looks aft over the rear casing of the boat with the wake beyond. Marcus Robinson, working in May 2012 in a biography of Hans Rose, has kindly pointed out the U-53 had both a forward and an aft-deck gun deck that Bergen has omitted, the latter in the cause of pictorial effect, although its position is still clear just in front of the raised aft hatch. He also draws attention to the school of dolphins, which Rose is watching on the far right horizon. Now, Bergen, generally what he did, he would stand in the conning tower and make a sketch, and on his return to Berlin, he would recreate the painting once back in Berlin. The painting has been signed by the artist and is dated 1918. It was transferred to the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich in England from the Naval War Trophies Committee in the mid-1940s. And in fact, I bought a copy of the Commander from the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich in England. And here is not a very good photograph of the copy of the painting that I have hanging on the wall in our home. All right, let's move on. Here is on slide 8. In 1963, Bergen gave his painting, The Atlantic, to President Kennedy, which is now displayed at the Kennedy Library in Boston, and donated a painting of Admiral Nelson's flagship HMS Victory to the British Admiralty. And the following year, his paintings illustrated the naval section of Life's magazine series on the First World War. Rather a fine painting of the Atlantic. Right, let's move on. Let's talk about my good friend Ib Odfeldt. I have a couple of paintings in my possession by Ib, originally commissioned by Heather, my wife, for my 65th birthday, some while ago now. Ib, who became a good friend of ours, is based in Tasmania. So a little bit about Ib's background. This is from some of the provenance that's on the back of the paintings. Ib Odfeldt was born in Denmark, 1944, migrating to Australia in 1972. He's a self-taught painter and sculptor. His life has always been devoted to art, and he has painted since the age of 16. It was his time spent in the Danish merchant navy which provided him with a deep and enduring interest in ships, their history, and the spirit of the maritime world. Each of Ib's paintings demonstrate a keen eye for technical accuracy. He combines this with an artist's skill and soul to produce work of balance and tranquility. This has created enormous interest amongst collectors who share the love of ships, the sea, and voyages in liners and cargo ships. Here's something again from the provenance on the back of the painting that I have by Ib. The painting we're going to look at in a minute is the motor vessel Highland Brigade by Ib, and you can see what he's written there. It's medium on board, it's on oil on board, and he did it in 2016 for me, and it depicts the Highland Brigade in the port of London in 1953. So here's a bit of history. I don't know whether you can see all this, but the Highland Brigade was one of 5 sister ships which were used for passenger and emigrant trade between London, Portugal, and South America. And in 1932, she came under the control of the Royal Mail Lines and continued this trade until 1940, when she was requisitioned as a troop ship. And she resumed South American service in 1947 until sold to John Latsis of Piraeus in Greece in 1959 and renamed Henriette. And then she was renamed Mariana the following year, rebuilt and used as a Mecca pilgrimage ship, eventually being scrapped in Taiwan about in 1965. Here is the painting of the Highland Brigade that I have in the port of London on the 17th of April, 1953, just pulling into the port of London, and there's the Elder Dempster Line boat, a Papa, just behind. Coincidentally, it's another boat that I had travelled on with my parents from West Africa. So here is the painting of the Highland Brigade. She was actually used to bring Australian prisoners of war back from Singapore after the end of the war. And I've got quite a number of photographs of Australian POWs coming back on the Highland Brigade to Australia. So just a little linked story here. The passenger inventory of the Highland Brigade. Here it says, one of the passengers was Nigel Rogers, 1 year old, and travelling with my parents, and the saying country of last permanent residence, Argentina, where I was born, country of intended future permanent residence, unknown. Story of my life in the early days with my parents, unknown. Right, let's move on. We're now going to look at a painting of the SS Talamanca at Puerto Barrios in Guatemala by my friend Ib Odfeldt. Here's some of the provenance on the back of the painting. Here's a little bit of the history of the Talamanca. She was a Mizar class store ship built in 1931 at Newport News Shipbuilding Dry Dock, Newport, and a passenger freighter combination liner and fruit cargo carrier for the United Mail Steamship Company of New York. Acquired by the US Navy 16th December 1941 from the United Mail Steamship Company, she was converted for naval service at Maryland Dry Dock in Baltimore, commissioned the USS Talamanca, number AF-15 on the 28th of January under Commander Nathan W. Bard in command. Decommissioned 29 November 45 in New Orleans, struck from the Naval Register December 1945, and returned to the United Fruit Company to go back to the business she was designed for in July 1947. Sold in 1st November 58 to Elder and Feist, renamed the SS Sulaco. Final disposition, scrapped at Bruges, Belgium. Arrived 8th of August 64, scrapping completed 1965. Finally went to the graveyard, but this time in Belgium. Okay, let's carry on. And here is the picture, the painting that Ib did for me of the Talamanca at Puerto Barrios in Guatemala. It's on the Caribbean side of Guatemala, rather a fine painting, and you can see some of the other United Fruit Company ships in the port there, and a character and a small boat observing what's going on. I still remember as a small lad, this is another boat I was on, looking up at that funnel, because they had a very distinctive colours, the funnel of the United Fruit Company, and there were always interesting characters on board. You know, there were all sorts of expatriates and interesting individuals leaving New York to go down to Central America, journalists, probably members of the CIA being dropped off, and all sorts of other interesting characters. And then they take fruit, bananas back to New York. And, you know, in those days, you all sort of sat together in one dining room for your dinner. There wasn't, you know, 49 different classes of travel. They were interesting times to travel on these extraordinary ships. Yes, here's the passenger inventory for the Talamanca out of New York, September 7th, 1956. Yes, Mr. Rogers again. Destination, Guatemala, indefinitely. Sailing from New York, heading for Havana, and also Puerto Barrios and Puerto Cortes, which is a port on the Honduran coast of the Caribbean. And here is a picture of the paintings that that Ib did for me. So there's myself with Ib holding the paintings at his home in Tasmania. Let's talk about Francis Smitheman. Francis Smitheman, Fellow of the Royal Society of Art, he is a British marine artist, and Francis has had works exhibited in London, in France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, and the United States. His lengthy studies as a painter included a scholarship to Paris. Later, he took a second degree in the history of European art at the Courtauld Institute at the University of London. He has many works in private collections, on board ships, and in museums. And at a major exhibition in France on his nomination as L'artiste d'honneur, the Roi du Nord stated, like his illustrious predecessor, Turner, Francis Smitheman knows the sea and sailing perfectly and endeavours to give his work authenticity. One finds all the world of sea in his works, the ports, the craft, the human activities on board, tempestuous seas and Arctic wastes. Francis was a very good friend of my father's, with my father commissioning Francis to paint various maritime paintings for him, which I and my family, my two brothers, have inherited the artwork. So let's move on. And here's the painting that I have done by Francis. It's Shackleton's Endurance beset by ice in the Weddell Sea. Shackleton's epic Antarctic expedition was beset by problems, including the loss of his ship, the Endurance. It was only by extreme determination and great self-sacrifice that he was able to save his colleagues from death. I think most of us will know the story of Shackleton. Here, the Endurance is gripped by pressure ice, which will eventually crush and sink her. The painting is now in my possession, having been originally commissioned by my father. The epic voyage of Endurance by Shackleton and his crew was my father's favourite story of extraordinary maritime endurance and courage against impossible odds. And here's a a sort of a different perspective of the painting. There, you very powerfully see it. So the previous one slide was the painting I have on the wall. This is an enlarged sort of electronic copy of the painting. Very powerful painting, wonderful painting, in my opinion. So let's just talk about a sort of linked story to the tale of the Endurance. Let's move to Frank Hurley. Everybody will know about Frank Hurley, I'm sure. He was involved in numerous expeditions, and here you see them all listed. The Australasian Antarctic Expedition under Mawson, the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition under Shackleton, which is the one that this painting relates to, where the Endurance, where they went to South Georgia, the Weddell Sea, Elephant Island, and South Georgia. The Banzar, British, Australian, New Zealand Antarctic Research Expedition, again under Mawson, and then again under Mawson in 1930 to 31. They're all listed here. I mean, extraordinary man, Frank Hurley, as we know. He's the iconic, legendary Australian photographer. And of course, he was not only the official photographer on numerous Antarctic expeditions, but also for the Australian military in World War I and World War II. So here's some of pictures. Frank Hurley with a camera on ice in front of the bow of the trapped Endurance in the Weddell Sea, Shackleton's expedition, 1915. And this comes from the National Library of Australia. What a powerful photograph that is. And here's one, this is by a photo by Frank Hurley. The crew set up ice mounds and rope along the ice to guide them in darkness and blizzards. The trapped Endurance is visible in the background. Wonderful, powerful photograph. And here you can see the similarity between that photograph and the painting, Endurance trapped in the Weddell Sea by Francis Smitheman. And you see the mounds with the ropes to guide them in blizzards and in the darkness to find their way back to the ship. Wonderful scene with all the dogs and people moving around on the ice, totally trapped. What an extraordinary, powerful painting. And here's the launching of the James Caird, again a photo by Frank Hurley. Shackleton and 5 others, of course, set out for South Georgia to seek help to take everybody home. The James Caird, it was named the James Caird. James Caird was one of the sponsors of Shackleton's expedition. All the boats, lifeboats, if you want to call them that, were all named after people that sponsored Shackleton. And there's an interesting tale to this of the James Caird in that Shackleton went to Dulwich College in London, in England. I went to Dulwich College prep myself, and that boat, the James Caird, to this day still sits outside the main cinema theatre at Dulwich College. And when I was a young lad of about 7 or 8, we were all frog marched in to watch the Dam Busters for the 58th time. As we came out, we'd throw our sweet wrappers into the James Caird. I'm very ashamed to say that we used to do that, but little did I know at the time the huge historic importance of the James Caird. So now let's go back to Francis Smitheman. This is a magnificent painting. We're at slide 28. This is HMS Bounty preparing to leave Opry Bay in Tahiti. Now, I think few of us can fail to be fascinated and moved by the Bounty's extraordinary voyage and the tragic mutiny. HMS Bounty had been in Matavai Bay since October 1788, and helped by the Tahitians, members of the crew had been growing breadfruit plants, the plan being to transport the living plants to the West Indies in order to create a new plantation there, I believe. Now, my late brother, Noel, and his family now have that original painting. It's quite magnificent. Give you time to have a look at that. Lovely painting. this is, I think, a truly wonderful painting, which I wish I owned, but I don't. And this is the East Indiaman Gothenburg in the Pearl River in China in July 1744. Now, founded in 1731, the Swedish East India Company was an important influence on the economic life of Sweden, especially in its trade with China. The Gothenburg is being loaded with bales of rattan from a barge, and at left is a busy settlement. At right, an old European hulk now acting as a repair depot for visiting ships. The Swedish East India Company was established to trade in East Asia. The company followed the Portuguese, Dutch, Danish, French, and English East India Company. Situated in Gothenburg, the company secured a 15-year monopoly of Far Eastern trade, exchanging Swedish timber, tar, iron, and copper for tea, porcelain, and silk. The company existed for 82 years, and its vessels made 131 voyages using 37 different ships. Even though the company in the end went bankrupt, as indeed did the Dutch East India Company, it made enormous profits during most of its years in operation and influenced the history of Sweden. Gothenburg was built at the Terra Nova shipyard in Stockholm and launched in 1738. And according to the writer Björn Alander, it only took about 1.5 years to build a ship of this size in the 1700s. It was built in the Swedish capital and named Gothenburg, or Göteborg, as Swedes say, because the Swedish East India Company resided in Gothenburg, and all expeditions began and ended at this port. The ship had a tonnage equivalent to about 830 tons. On its maiden voyage in 1739, the ship carried 30 cannons, an initial crew of 144. The ship made 3 journeys to China, and then in September 1745, it sank on its way into Gothenburg harbour. After 30 months at sea, with only 900 meters to go before the vessel reached its berth, it crashed into the Knipla Borre, a well-known rock in Gothenburg harbour. Although it remains a mystery how this could happen, many theories abound. The ship remained stranded on the rock while much of the cargo, consisting of tea, porcelain, spices, and silk, was salvaged. The ship was clearly visible above the surface of the water for many years, but in time, the remains sank to the bottom. So it's a magnificent painting, I'm sure you would agree. And here is some porcelain from the Gothenburg with the Swedish East India Company pattern made specially in China for the company. And on my numerous trips to Gothenburg, where my daughter works at the university, I've seen some of this in the museum at Gothenburg, where the headquarters of the Swedish East India Company work. But they had this pattern made for them. This was the traditional pattern of the Swedish East India Company. They all had patterns, including the Dutch East India Company. They had their own logos and patterns on their porcelain, all made in China. So there is an interesting connection also of this story. And here, the Swedes built a replica of the Gothenburg. It's one of the largest sailing operational ships today. It's a replica of the Gothenburg. And here I am, if you look at the photos from left to right, there's the bosun of the Gothenburg and me, Anna, my daughter, at the stern of the Gothenburg in Gothenburg harbour. And indeed, the Swedish India man, Gothenburg, there you see it. She's absolutely magnificent. And in fact, there is a story here that the bosun there, that the young lady, she actually helped to sail the replica of the Gothenburg to Shanghai in August 2005, returning to Gothenburg on June 9th. So she was in charge of sails and ropes and so on. Extraordinary woman. Her sister apparently lives in Sydney. And as a little memento of my visit, I handed my Naval Historical Society cap to the bosun and said, one day, if you ever come to Australia, you must look up our society. So she was very pleased to receive my Naval Historical Society cap. So there's the bit of a linkage into the modern day replica of the Gothenburg. Right, let's move on. Let's talk about Ian Hansen, Australian, and David, I know is one of your, David Michael, our president, I know that's one of your favourite artists. Now, Ian, I think is well known to many of us. Ian was born in South Australia, and his childhood years were spent on the foreshore of Hurley Bay in Queensland. Ian had a natural talent for drawing, and at 8 years old, he was painting with watercolours and moved to oils when he was 11. Ian joined the Royal Australian Navy at 15 and served for 12 years, including service at HMS Sydney in 67 to 68 during the Vietnam War. Ian painted continually in off-duty hours, recording the ships and scenes he observed during his travels. When he left the Navy, Ian became a successful full-time painter, and has since had exhibitions in the US, UK, and Australia. Ian lives and works in Hunters Hill in Sydney. And in 2000, Ian was invited by the Royal Australian Navy to go to East Timor and record the Navy's involvement during the crisis. He spent time on several ships, sketching and painting. The resulting paintings now hang in the Navy's fleet headquarters. He did a trip to Antarctica in 2002 aboard the Sir Hubert Wilkins on a 5-week voyage, during which Ian sketched and painted the magnificent scenes of the great southern continent. And in 2013, Ian was appointed as the official artist for the International Fleet Review 2013, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Royal Australian Navy. And Ian now mainly does commission artworks such as the postage stamp of HMVS Cerberus, launched by the Australian Post in March 2021 to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the vessel's historic entry to service in Australia in 1871. Ian is a Fellow of the Royal Art Society, a Fellow of the Australian Institute of History and Arts, and a Fellow of the Australian Society of Marine Artists. His works are very extensive. They hang in Government House in Sydney, the Sydney Stock Exchange, the Australian National Maritime Museum, Sydney Heritage Fleet, Royal Australian Navy, the Naval Historical Society, the Royal Sydney Yacht Squadron, Lady Denman Museum, AMP Building, Qantas House, Huskinson Maritime Museum, Jervis Bay, and many corporate and private collections throughout the world. So let's look at some of Ian's paintings. Here's HMS Stalwart by Ian. Stalwart was one of 55 S-class destroyers built for the British Admiralty under the emergency shipbuilding programme of World War I. She commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Stalwart in April 1919. He was not long in commission, however, when she and her sister ship Success, Swordsman, Tasmania, and Tattoo, along with the flotilla leader Anzac, were gifted to the Royal Australian Navy as replacements for the Royal Australian Navy's obsolete River-class destroyers. Rather a magnificent painting, making way in rather sort of heavy water, heavy seas. We'll look at some of other paintings by Ian. This is quite magnificent, by Ian. It's of the First Fleet at Sydney Cove. You can see all the activity there, the Union Jack flying, various Marines wandering around, tents, and a magnificent scene of the First Fleet in Sydney Cove. I like that painting, it's very powerful. And here is another painting by Ian, The Ocean. It's called Supreme 3, done in 2017. Very powerful painting. I think it's probably one of 3. I'm not so familiar with this painting, but I think it's quite magnificent, captures the power of the ocean. Wonderful painting by Ian Hansen. I really like this painting. This is the Hammerhead Crane at Garden Island by Ian Hansen. And you can see some figures wandering along the dockside there out of the steam and the mist. very atmospheric, and you've got the hammerhead crane. It's hugely powerful crane at Garden Island. Wonderful painting. I think Ian really captures it very well. And here's Calling the Watch by Ian, Ian Hansen. I really like this painting as well. I think changing the watch, you know, if you suffer from mal de mer, you'd be seriously in trouble here. This gives you a really powerful sense of the power of the sea, and the crew changing watch and getting ready to go to their stations. Magnificent painting by Ian. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's coming up to about 40 minutes since my presentation ended. That's it. So that's the end. Thank you very much for listening to me today. You'll all be able to go off and have your lunch now on the east coast of Australia and go and do some Christmas shopping. Thank you very much.
Ian, Nigel, thank you very much. That's a wonderful presentation. You've really connected art and history, which is certainly the theme of the society. You've also, by showing me those couple of last paintings by Ian Hansen, there's a couple of must adds to our website as well, particularly the train. So thank you.